Vincent Simmons was accused of the rape of Karen Sanders and Sharon Sanders in 1977. They were 14-year-old white twins, and Vincent Simmons allegedly had brutally raped both of them, along with Keith Laborde, the cousin, who was, along with them, put in the trunk, pistol whipped, etc. And Vincent Simmons was charged with aggravated rape and identified by the victims as the rapist, and he was given a trial, lasted less than 2 days, and was given a 100-year sentence, 2 50-year sentences, and he's been serving in Angola prison ever since. End of story. Basically threw away the key. Problem is, in 1994, a writ of mandamus was filed, which brought to light certain documents that were basically suppressed in the trial. The medical examiner report for both of the twins, the initial statements made by the victims, the initial interviews made by the victims, the police report, which included the shooting of Vincent Simmons while in police custody, etc. And up comes a gentleman by the name of Jonathan Stack, who was a documentary filmmaker, and he produced 2 documentaries. One was called The Farm, that was in 1998, and another one in 1999, Shadows of Doubt. The documentary The Farm was a compilation of several stories by Angola inmates, and the Shadows of Doubt focused on Vincent Simmons, and it basically brought to light these various documents that were suppressed in the trial. Not only in the trial, in the preliminary hearing. So one of the things that was brought to light in these documents was that Sharon Sanders, one of the twins, was found to be a virgin by the medical examiner. Now, a lot of people, specifically Eddie Knoll, the prosecutor in the case, have made the point, well, it didn't say virgin, it says her hymen was intact. The problem is that the medical examiner report contained one other factor, which really wasn't addressed by the former prosecutor, which I'll talk about a little later. I don't want to get into it now, but I'll talk about it in a few minutes. But another one of the factors in the suppressed documents was that Vincent Simmons is not named in any of the initial statements, the initial interviews, except for the medical exam report. The problem being that in the preliminary hearing and the trial, all of the victims said, oh, he said his name was Vincent Simmons from the beginning. Let me back up a little bit. Basically, the alleged incident began at a 7-Eleven in Marksville, Louisiana on Tunica Drive. Allegedly, the victims, Sharon Sanders, Karen Sanders, and Keith Laborde, had left their grandparents' house to go to Keith Laborde's house to help clean the house. Keith Laborde, the 18-year-old cousin. His wife was in the hospital. She was pregnant. There was some type of complication in regard to her condition with diabetes, and she was supposed to get discharged the following day, and Keith Laborde had asked his two 14-year-old cousins to go over to his house, help him clean up the house, because he wanted his house to look nice for his wife, who was coming home the next day. Well, after they cleaned the house about 9 o'clock, on the way back to the grandparents' house to drop the two twins off, Keith noticed that he was low on gas, so he stopped at the 7-Eleven. And here they supposedly met Vincent Simmons. Now, in the initial statements, all they say is black man, nigger, color guy, etc. Never mentioning the name Vincent Simmons. In the preliminary hearing and the trial, they all say, well, he said his name was Simmons from the beginning. But anyway, so Vincent Simmons supposedly starts arguing with Keith Laborde, saying, you tried to hit me, etc., etc. And apparently they make up. Vincent Simmons asked to be taken home or to a party. It differs depending on which part of the initial statements you read. And he says, turn here, turn there, turn here. They're driving down some dirt road, which turned out to be Little California Road. And subsequently, Vincent Simmons is said to have raped Sharon Sanders for about 30 minutes. And in the initial statements, there is no description of Vincent Simmons having trouble penetrating her. This only occurs in the preliminary hearing and in the trial, probably because the prosecution feared that the medical examiner report stating that Sharon Sanders was had her hymen intact, would come to light, and they would have a way out of that. But in the initial statements, there is no description of this having trouble, quote unquote, penetrating her. All she says is that he raped her for 30 minutes. He ejaculated in her. And then he subsequently raped Karen Sanders vaginally, rectally, orally, for an hour and a half. The major problems in the case is that they allegedly arrive at the 7-Eleven at 9 o'clock. They're talking with Vincent Simmons, initially arguing with him, or Keith Laborde is arguing with him. They make up. All this transpires in about 30 minutes, they say. And so they leave the 7-Eleven about 9:30, and he subsequently rapes the two girls. Subsequently, he is driving around with them in the trunk, etc. At one point, they say he punctures the tire. Now keep in mind that they are about 2.5 to 3 miles away from town, and they're 5 miles away from the grandparents' house. So you have about 7.5 to 8 miles that they're driving back on a flat tire. Now you take the time that they left 7-Eleven, which was about 9:30, half an hour for raping Sharon, an hour and a half for raping Karen Sanders, and maybe like a half an hour of Vincent Simmons supposedly driving down all these dirt roads with them in the trunk. Then they stop at the cemetery in Marksville, and then on this flat tire, which for anybody that has driven on a flat tire knows, you can't drive very fast on a flat tire. And very shortly after getting a flat tire and driving on your flat tire, the tire basically deteriorates. So you have basically two factors. Number one, the 7 to 8 miles that they're driving on this flat tire would take a fair amount of time. The problem is you have number one that they can't drive very fast on this flat tire. Okay. Number two, if they do drive fairly fast on the flat tire, basically what's going to happen is the tire is basically going to disintegrate. It's going to disintegrate no matter what. But as they drive faster, the tire is just going to disintegrate more. Basically what's going to happen is the rim of the tire, the metal, is going to come into contact with the road. Now, the Little California road supposedly is gravel and or dirt. But, once they get into Marksville, they're basically riding on concrete. So what basically is happening, or is going to happen, is that, number one, they would have to drive extremely slow, driving back to the grandparents' house, 10 miles an hour, maybe 15 at the most. Number two, as you're driving on the metal rim is, grinding against the concrete, what's going to happen is basically sparks are going to be created from the massive amount of friction. For instance, in my hometown, Riverside, California, we had a former police chief who had went to a strip club, drank a number of alcoholic beverages. I was quite drunk by the time he left around midnight, and he was so drunk that he had hit a curb, flattening one of his tires. And witnesses seeing the chief of police driving down the road, and it was in a city supplied unmarked police car, driving down the road, and literally there's these sparks shooting off into the night. Well, why does this matter? Well, one of the things that is stated in the initial statement by Keith Labordi, it's not said by the twins, oddly, but it came up in the preliminary hearing and it came up in the trial, where Vincent Simmons had supposedly, while he's putting the victims in the trunk and taking them out, etc., asked for a a siphon hose, and he pulls out the gas can. It was described as an green army gas can, and for whatever reason, they say that he wanted to siphon out the gas out of the gas tank, which really doesn't make any sense, except for, they say, well, maybe he wanted to burn us. But there's no siphon hose, so what he does, supposedly, allegedly, is take a tire tool and punctures the hole in the gas tank. Which, number one, if you look at the gas tank for the car, it was a 1969 Chevy Malibu, how somebody would, put a hole in a gas tank with a tire tool, it's very difficult, if not impossible. The other thing is, most people realize this, but, gas is extremely flammable. So if you're, taking a tire tool and you're trying to poke a hole in the gas tank, there's a good chance you're going to blow yourself up. In fact, people have been blown up by, trying to do that, because it just basically just takes one little spark to, blow the car up. The point being that, Vincent Simmons supposedly had, put a hole in the gas tank, and so you basically have, gas being poured out, and or fumes, they're driving down the road, and, Vincent Simmons supposedly had punctured the tire. So, more than likely, as they're driving down the road, before they dropped off Vincent Simmons in Marksville, before they went home, there are these sparks flying into the night. I mean, the question is, how it happened the way they said it happened, why didn't the car blow up? So, I mean, that's another issue. Another issue is that, and that's something that, the former prosecutor, Eddie Knoll, didn't address, was that in the initial statements, Vincent Simmons is said to have gone into the 7-Eleven with Karen Sanders. What she says happened, which gets suppressed in the trial, gets suppressed in the preliminary hearing, is that they had gotten $2 worth of gas. Vincent Simmons says, "Hey, why don't you get $2 of gas free by telling the 7-Eleven clerk that you didn't get your gas?" So he goes into the 7-Eleven with Karen Sanders. According to her, he basically forces her to go in. Here's the problem. The fact that, Vincent Simmons allegedly went into the 7-Eleven gets suppressed in the preliminary hearing, gets suppressed in the trial. They simply said that he was out at the gas pumps. Well, during the trial, Harold Brulette, the defense attorney for Vincent Simmons, brings forward some alibi witnesses that say that, Vincent Simmons was nowhere near the 7-Eleven on the night in question, and these alibi witnesses come forward, and basically what the prosecution does, Eddie Knoll and his wife, co-prosecutor Jeanette Knoll, do is they impeach these, alibi witnesses by saying that, well, you're just a bunch of criminals. And they literally, if you read the trial transcripts, it's unbelievable. The trial was an absolute circus. They're impeaching these these alibi witnesses by saying, "Oh, you committed such and such a crime back here and back then, and did you commit this crime, and did you?" I mean, it just goes on and on during this trial. Literally like 1/3 of the trial is, the prosecution reading rap sheets to these alibi witnesses, and basically saying, "Well, because you guys have committed crimes in the past, you can't be trusted. You're lying." And of course, the problem is that two of the prosecution witnesses were had not only committed crimes, they were in jail at the time of during the trial. The prosecutor said of one of the alibi witnesses, "Well, you committed this crime, this crime, and this crime," and one of the crimes, if you read through the transcripts, is the crime of littering. This is these are the straws that the prosecution is grabbing at, but the prosecution's two witnesses that were in jail, one of them had been convicted of manslaughter. So there's this comparison. What these two witnesses were saying was that Vincent Simmons had on a certain date been wearing certain colored clothes, maroon pants and a black silk shirt, etc., which allegedly was the clothing that was worn by Vincent Simmons during the crime. But the clothes were never offered into evidence. The gun that Vincent Simmons supposedly was waving around was never offered into evidence. The knife that he supposedly put to Karen Sanders' neck was never found, was never offered as evidence. In fact, in one of the police reports by Robert Laborde, one of the deputy sheriffs, he says that Vincent Simmons, after he picked up Vincent Simmons, after they took the interviews and he picked up Vincent Simmons, Vincent Simmons supposedly had a knife in his hand that he took, he confiscated and took into evidence, which there's a problem with that, which I'll get into a little later. One of the things that the prosecutor in regard to Sharon Sanders was that he found no bruising on her body. So, you may ask, well, so what? She was brutally raped, but that doesn't necessarily mean that she's going to have bruising on her body. Now, the medical examiner examined the twins 2 weeks after it happened. But one of the major problems is in the initial statements and more pointedly in the preliminary hearing and the trial, Sharon specifically states that after Vincent Simmons had put her in the trunk, she, not wanting him to close the trunk, had put her knees up. And she describes Vincent Simmons literally slamming the trunk on her knees, literally jumping on the trunk to try to get this trunk closed. Think about it. You've got a 14-year-old girl, weighs 90-something pounds. You've got a full-grown man slamming and jumping on a trunk, hitting a 14-year-old girl's knees. Well, aside from the fact that, if somebody, a grown man is slamming a trunk on a young girl's knees, Probably going to break some bones. But let's put that aside. Let's just say, it's going to cause severe bruising. Well, 2 weeks after the incident, the alleged rape, there's no bruising at all. Zero. In the least, there would have been severe bruising that would have lasted weeks, if not months. So, there's basically, no way that it could happen. It could have happened the way that she described it. One more factor: Karen Sanders' medical exam report. In the initial statements and the trial, the preliminary examination, she says that he raped her anally, and there's this strange verbiage that she uses that he's raping her vaginally, and then he asked her, have you ever been had sex anally, and so he rapes her anally, and she says that it hurts less rectally than vaginally, so do it the other way. But the problem in the medical exam report is that there is no reference in the medical exam report to a rectal examination. Why? Because if you think about it, you're going to have probably more physical damage in the rectum than you are to the vagina. Number one, because Karen Sanders had said that she wasn't a virgin. So you basically have a full-grown male, without getting too graphic, full-grown, his junk, to use the term that we have been using lately. Raping a girl anally. What's more than likely going to happen is that there's going to be some rectal tearing. There's probably going to be some blood, etc. So that, why didn't the medical examiner say, we need to, you need to look at your rectum because, there may be tearing, there may be infection, etc. But there's absolutely no word of that, which indicates to me that there's basically no basis for the anal rape. Now, I'd like to discuss the problem with the timeline, and if we could put, while I'm describing this, if we could put on screen some of the timelines that I've prepared that show the impossibility of the timeline as they describe it, because I guess I forgot to admit before, they leave Keith Laborde's house at 9 p.m. at night. They get home or at the grandparents' house at midnight, depending on what document you look at, what transcript you look at. It's midnight or 10 after midnight. I mean, it's about 12. So you basically have this 3-hour period where everything happened. Of course, the problem is that, Sharon says she was raped for 30 minutes. Karen says that she was raped for, I think actually Sharon says that Karen was raped for 90 minutes, an hour and a half. They're at the 7-Eleven for approximately half an hour. They're in the trunk for, undetermined amount of time. The way that they're describing it, they're in the trunk. Vincent Simmons is driving down all these dirt roads and there's dust coming in to the trunk and they can't breathe, etc. They don't say how long exactly they were in the trunk, but I mean, it's obviously that it was longer than, 5 minutes, because they're describing, having trouble breathing, and they're, praying, and I mean, they're trying to comfort each other, and they're trying to, pull the lights out of the back of the car to, get some air, etc. But, so you have an hour and a half rape of Karen. You have 30 minutes rape of Sharon. You have, let's say, at least 30 minutes in the trunk. They're in the trunk. You have the amount of time that Vincent Simmons took to, puncture the tire, which, puncturing the tire, okay, I'll give you, that could be like a fast thing. Stick the knife in, and it's, flat. But the, puncturing of a gas tank, which, it's basically, if you look at, we'll put a picture on screen of this gas tank, not that specific gas tank, but that specific year. How exactly Vincent Simmons got under the car and pried a hole in the gas tank. But I mean, it would have taken a fair amount of time. In fact, in the trial, the prosecutor, Eddie Knoll, wants to take the jurors out to see this hole in the tank, which they basically, couldn't, by, looking under the car, couldn't see it. They had to have, somebody either raise the car up, or it's not really explaining exactly, what happened, but, how exactly, Vincent Simmons supposedly put a hole in the gas tank is one question. But, we're talking about the timeline now. Let's say, half an hour. So, assuming that, they simply, stopped in Marksville and, they lived in Marksville, you probably could, fit the 3 hours in. But the problem is, from, the time they dropped off Vincent Simmons, they had to drive 5.5 miles on a flat tire. There is not enough time. Another interesting thing is that the twins had, prior to living in Marksville with their grandparents, had lived with their mother in Alexandria, Louisiana. 3 months before, they had been living with their grandparents for 3 months. And one of the things that had come up in the preliminary examination was that the twins had been suspended from school in Alexandria. Well, I can't remember if it was either the trial or the preliminary examination where this came up. We'll put the proper the reference when we do post-production. But so anyway, Harold Burlett is cross-examining Karen, and he asked her about this fact that they were suspended from school in Marksville. And once she says that yeah, we were suspended, then strangely, very oddly, in the trial, I think it was a trial, the trial stops. The defense asks for a recess. And when the trial resumes, it's as if the statement was never made. Now this is the problem that I basically had as far as there being a collusion between Harold Burlett and the husband and wife team, the Knowles. Because, these strange things come up, like, the this writing down of names. Let me back up a second. As far as writing down names, basically what this concern was supposedly that, Vincent Simmons had told Karen, get a pencil and paper and write down your names because, I want to know your names in case you go to the police and tell so I can come and kill you. But getting back to the suspension, when Harold Burlett actually brings this out. And, if there was like a collusion between the Knowles and Harold Burlett, why would he bring something like that out? So, there was this back and forth in my mind, investigating the case as to, if they were in collusion, why was he bringing something like this up to begin with? But on the other hand, when it comes up that, they were suspended, why does he just drop it? So it's a strange thing. But basically, it didn't get suppressed in the trial, but it just kind of just gets dropped. It's like this ball that, the defense could have like seized on and said, hey, we need to go to the school and find out why you guys were suspended. Was it drugs? If they had accused, we don't know this right now. They could have accused some male teacher of, trying to rape them and found to be lying. That would obviously, be a bombshell in the trial. Or were they found to be using drugs? Was that why they were suspended? You got to think about this. You have Karen and Sharon Sanders living with their mother in Alexandria, Louisiana. Okay, their parents are divorced. For some unknown reason, they get suspended from school, and they get transferred. And it appears that they got transferred mid-year. To another school. They're living with their grandparents. We don't know why they're suspended. Well, here's another factor in the suppressed initial statements. The initial statements, the initial interviews have Karen and Keith Laborde admitting that they had, the night that this allegedly happened, Karen had marijuana. Says that she had two marijuana roaches, hidden in her bra, and the black guy, the nigger, the color guy, that's how he's named in the initial interviews and statements. Asked them, hey, you guys got any pot? And Karen pulls out these two roaches. Well, that completely gets suppressed in the trial. There's no mention of it because basically, if you read the trial, the prosecution portrays these two little innocent girls. Oh, they're so innocent, and this evil Vincent Simmons deflowered them, and Karen Sanders, in the trial, in the preliminary hearing, there's nothing about the fact that she's not a virgin. In the initial statements, the medical examiner report, it stated that she isn't a virgin. But, during the trial, there's no mention of the fact that, she was not a virgin. So you basically have this, lily white, the southern pure white girls being portrayed in the trial, and oh, they're so upset, and they're crying, and this evil person came along and deflowered them. Well, the fact of the matter was, they were doing drugs, or at least they had drugs. Karen had drugs. They were suspended from school. And more than likely, if you read, these various things, that these documents that, basically got suppressed, these weren't innocent girls. A 14-year-old girl who's carrying around marijuana in her bra, and her 18-year-old cousin that knows about this, they're probably like, some party animals. If you look at the initial statements, the description of this suspect, this perpetrator of this crime, is so absolutely vague. There's no way that they could have picked up anyone from this description. It's just, he had a tattoo. I don't remember what it was. It was a design, some kind of design. I don't remember what kind of design it was. And he had a kind of short afro, and how like their hair does. And if you look at the initial documents, the initial interviews, there's absolutely no connection to how they could have went from the description given in the initial statements to how they determined that it was Vincent Simmons. It doesn't really make any sense. For instance, in the Sharon's initial statement, she says, as far as description, he was short, husky, and dark. I mean, how you went from that to Vincent Simmons. He had close cropped hair. So I mean, it doesn't make any sense. And getting back to the the fact that Sharon Sanders' hymen was intact. Eddie Knoll, after the documents came to light, he's basically saying, well, Vincent Simmons was having trouble. He was having trouble, penetrating Sharon. Well, not only does Sharon initially, in the initial statements, initial interviews, not say anything about him having any trouble, she says that, after he raped her, she bled. Meaning, her hymen was, punctured. And, the blood from her hymen being, punctured, went on her panties. So, I mean, there's this disconnect between, what she says and, what actually happened. And it's interesting, if you look at the medical examiner report, Sharon Sanders, when she first goes in to see the medical examiner, she doesn't mention anything about him having any trouble. After the medical examiner, tries to examine her vaginally, he can't even insert one finger into her vagina. It's so, because of the hymen, it's just, he can't even put one finger in there. So, and supposedly, Vincent Simmons had, raped her for half an hour, and she bled, and, it was on her panties, and, her grandmother washed the panties the next day, and I guess the blood, miraculously, it was washed out of her panties. What is, as far as the shooting of Vincent Simmons, very strange series of events that occurs. Robert Laborde, the arresting officer, who, by the way, didn't testify in the trial. In fact, there were no police officers that had anything to do with the case testified in the trial. There was one police officer that testified, basically refuting the alibi witnesses, saying that, what you're talking about, as far as this event that, Vincent Simmons was involved in, he was involved in this fight, etc. That happened on a different day, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, Robert Laborde, who arrested Vincent Simmons and wrote 2 police reports, which we'll put on screen. Says that after the after the witnesses gave their statements and did their interviews, that he thought it was Vincent Simmons. So, which we basically shown there's no way that you can go from what the witnesses said to Vincent Simmons as far as description. But anyway, aside from that fact, he says that he arrested Vincent Simmons, picked him up, and as Vincent Simmons is exiting the police car, they're at the courthouse, he says, Robert Laborde says that, Vincent Simmons is clutching a knife. And he says, I'm not going to take this rap. I'm not going to take it. I'll, after I find out, what I'm being charged with, then I'll give up this knife, which is completely ridiculous. I mean, how many police officers do you know that would put a person that they're arresting in a police car without searching them? Where did Vincent Simmons have it? And the idea is that if Vincent Simmons hadn't been clutching this knife, I mean, Robert Laborde, he describes this clutching this knife in this overly dramatic manner. He should have been a novelist or something, but Vincent Simmons is clutching this knife, and I'm not going to take the rap, blah blah blah, and Robert Laborde says that he pries open his hand and takes this knife out. I mean, so supposedly, if Vincent Simmons hadn't been clutching this knife as he's exiting the police car, then they would never have found the knife. He would have gone into the courthouse, and he would have been charged with the crime, or taken to a lineup without them ever searching him. It doesn't make any sense. So I mean, obviously it was made up. But so anyway, Robert Laborde describes that Vincent, in his police report, that Vincent Simmons is taken into the lineup, and he's given a number 4, and they're lined up, which the lineup is kind of strange because there's one white guy in the lineup. Why is there a white guy in the lineup? It doesn't make any sense. And Karen Sanders and Sharon Sanders and Keith Laborde are behind the two-way glass, and they pick out the they pick out number 4. Oh, number 4 is the one, and so they start processing Vincent Simmons. Well, while they're fingerprinting him, taking his picture, etc., supposedly Vincent Simmons, grabs one of the police officers' guns, waving it around. I'm not going to take this rap. And, Robert Laborde, the hero, tells the police officer, the other deputy sheriff, get out of the way, I'm going to, because, supposedly, the police officer that had the deputy sheriff whose gun was taken, supposedly he's in between Robert Laborde and Vincent Simmons. So he says, get out of the way, and, Robert Laborde, shoots Vincent Simmons, according to the police report, in the shoulder. And here's the problem. There's 2 police reports, and we'll put the 2 police reports on screen. One of the police reports says that Robert Laborde heard a scuffle and looked up, and Vincent Simmons had the gun in his hand. The other police report says that he saw Vincent Simmons pull the gun out of the holster. So, I mean, there's this contradiction. Number 2, Robert Laborde says, "Oh, I shot him in the shoulder." Basically, hey, I didn't try to kill him. I wanted him to drop the gun and everything. Everybody to be fine. And shot him in the chest. Says that he shot him in the shoulder, but if you look at the emergency room and hospital report, shot him in the chest. And that's another problem. That's another problem. You know, Vincent Simmons recovering from a gunshot wound. A couple months later goes to trial, and you know the trial lasts a day and a half. In fact, you know, we'll put it on the screen. On the second day of the trial, the judge says, "Hey, you know, we got other cases, so come on, let's hurry this along." You know, guy's going to prison for you know, possibly 100 years. And it's a 2-day trial, day and a half. Vincent Simmons was initially charged with aggravated rape, which carried the death penalty, 1977. What happened was, 1977, the Supreme Court had said for a short time that the death penalty was unconstitutional, cruel and unusual punishment. So they changed the aggravated rape charge, which carried the death penalty, to attempted aggravated rape. And according to Eddie Knoll, we changed it because you know, I didn't want to have to sequester the jury, because if it would have been a death penalty case, then we would have had to sequester the jury. I mean, think about it. The jury, the trial lasted a day and a half, and he's worried about sequestering the jury. I mean, we're talking like O.J. Simpson trial, you know, where it's lasting months and months. I mean, a day and a half of sequestering trial. I mean, what the truth of the matter was that, you know, they couldn't charge him with aggravated rape because it would carry the death penalty. Here's the ironic thing. You know, those that were convicted of, you know, crimes that carry the death penalty, you know, because it got, because the death penalty, you know, was deemed unconstitutional at the time, their sentences actually got converted to less time. So if Vincent Simmons had been convicted of aggravated rape, he'd probably be out of prison right now, you know, but you got 100 years. Here's the other interesting thing. Vincent Simmons was never arraigned on attempted aggravated rape. There's absolutely no paperwork that that says that he was ever arraigned on attempted aggravated rape. So basically, he was convicted on something that he was never charged with. You know, this also plays into Eddie Knoll's, you know, playing of games with words, saying that, you know, as far as the Sharon Sanders' hymen being intact, well, he was convicted of attempted rape. It wasn't an aggravated rape, it was attempted rape. So, you know, this fits into the her hymen being intact. So, but he was never arraigned on that charge. So, I mean, but you know, we'll put the documents on this case on our website. We'll put the website up, and for everyone that wants to read the trial transcripts and the whole everything. It was the whole trial, the whole investigation was a farce. So, you know, and you know, Vincent Simmons' case actually got appealed to the Louisiana Supreme Court, and excuse me, and the Supreme Court said, there's no new evidence. There's nothing new. You know, it denied, blah, blah, blah. Well, what do you think's sitting on the Supreme Court? Well, one of the former prosecutors, Jeanette Knoll, who, you know, quote unquote, recused herself from the decision. But I mean, there was, I mean, so much absolute suppression of, you know, all the documents that, I mean, it's obvious that she had, you know, her opinion, you know, made its way into the decision. And so you have a man, Vincent Simmons, went into prison in 1977, a young man, accused of a crime that he didn't commit, and you know, doesn't look like, you know, unless, you know, the public rise up and say, you know, let this guy out. This trial was a farce. Unless that happens, you know, he's probably gonna die in prison. So you know, our organization, kzvideo and photography, has been trying to help him. We've filed some criminal complaints against the former deputy, Robert Laborde. We've applied for Freedom of Information Act for the twins, Karen and Sharon Sanders, school records, you know, to see if they were suspended from school, Brame Junior High School in Alexandria, for drugs, or, you know, did they accuse some teacher of rape, etc. We are, you know, we produced this documentary, which it's kind of a rough cut. We've you know, we don't have a lot of money. We put it together with, you know, basically zero funding. So we're asking the public to, you know, look at the documents. They're on our website. Write letters to congressmen. You know, write letters to, or emails to Department of Justice to help Vincent Simmons to be released from prison, because he doesn't belong there. In fact, the former district attorneys, Jeanette and Eddie Knoll, they belong in prison, not Vincent Simmons. The two girls and Keith Laborde that lied on the witness stand, they should be convicted of perjury. The two witnesses from the prosecution called that were in jail at the time, they should be convicted of perjury. So we're hoping that the public would rally around Mr. Simmons. Initially, when Shadows of Doubt and The Farm was, you know, first came out, there was a huge uproar, you know, about the injustice that was perpetrated on Mr. Simmons. And, you know, when Eddie Knoll, you know, first came out and said, well, you know, he had trouble, and, you know, he had trouble raping her, and that's why her hymen was intact, and, you know, they initially didn't say, they didn't admit that they knew his name because they were scared, etc., etc. And he was actually charged with aggravated rape. It was attempted aggravated rape, so it doesn't matter. That doesn't wash. I mean, the problem with the timeline, the problem with the Vincent Simmons, you know, supposedly going into the 7-Eleven, and, you know, they not simply calling the 7-Eleven clerk to, instead of spending, you know, several hours impeaching his alibi witnesses, you know, they didn't have to do that because they suppressed the initial statements. The suppression of the medical examiner report, the suppression of the documents, the disconnect between Robert Laborde's two police reports, the obvious collusion between the Harold Burlett and the Knowles, the fact that Vincent Simmons got 100 years for a trial that was basically a farce. All of these things, we hope that the public and the Department of Justice and the Louisiana Department of Justice will take into account to, right this injustice that has occurred on Mr. Simmons. We're going to continue to help him. There are several other people that are still trying to help him, that have been trying to help him for a very long time, and will continue to help him, to try to help him. But we need the public's help. So we'll put the information on screen, and meanwhile, kzvideo and photography, the producer of this documentary, we admit this is kind of a rough cut, but we're gonna hopefully, by people seeing this documentary, this video, we'll donate some money, or help with the cause, so we can do some more for Vincent Simmons, or make a better documentary, or etc.
Two little girls took the stand, lied through their teeth about a man, lied through their teeth about a man. Led 'em away for 100 years, led 'em away with a mountain of tears, led 'em away with a mountain of tears. Gather round, hear what I say. Justice it went away. Justice it went away. Free Vincent Simmons. Free Vincent Simmons. Free Vincent Simmons. Free